A world beyond humans. That's something that few of us really stop to consider. And yet, it is the world, really, that we live in. And it's our conditioned, human centric worldview that stops us recognizing that and certainly stops us relating to that and all the beings that make that up. I was considering, as I was pondering recording this introduction to the episode, how I was raised in a way that perhaps invited me into an understanding of the non-human world that's not common. One of my profound childhood memories is of my father and seeing him cry for the very first time. And it was actually during the burial of our companion rat, Dr. Rat, an albino rat who was very adventurous and characterful. And it deeply affected my father and I when he passed. And witnessing my father speaking out these words of blessings as we buried Dr. Rat and seeing his tears, there was something so magical, so profound, so opening into a different way of experiencing and seeing the world and valuing different lives that I believe has really affected so much of how I've taken that understanding into decisions I've made since. And that's just a single example. There's many more I could give you. And so in this episode with Erik Jampa Andersson, we really are exploring this notion of this very anthrocentric worldview that we have in this modern world, and looking at whether that's actually natural for us, the costs, the very real costs, certainly to the non-human world, but also perhaps to us as humans, and ways that perhaps we could reclaim something that's truer for us, something ancient, something that allows us to relate to these more than human beings. This is an episode that I think is a conversation that we really need to be in right now as humans if we want to reclaim something of ourselves that perhaps was lost as we moved into this modern way of thinking and being. I think you're going to love it. Let's dive in. Hello, Erik. A huge welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. It's great to be here.
I am delighted we're here and having this conversation. As I was saying to you, I first came across you and your work in the Watkins Mind, Body and Spirit magazine. And what you were talking about there in terms of that re-enchantment and the non-human world, and really the invitation for those of us that perhaps already feel as though I don't know, perhaps, in some form of nature-based spirituality, shamanism, so already have that kind of relationship and worldview that is recognizing there are, many other beings as well as humans. What I really saw in your article and really am excited to get into in this conversation is like there's a deeper invitation present there for us. There is more to do. In a really beautiful, magical way, but there is more for us to do, and it's important that we do that. So I am really excited to have that conversation.
No, me too. Yeah, very glad that you read it and that you you enjoyed that article. I really that article felt very important for me. Yeah, I think, in these sorts of communities that, we both have been in for a long time, I think the vested interest in working with so-called nature, with non-human beings, with the more than human world, and an interest in really delving into some of those topics and issues, I think that's a fertile ground for having more critical and important conversations about our place within the more than human world. And I mean, there's really no more important time for those conversations to be had. So I hope that more people are drawn to this kind of work because, these folks we are the change makers, those of us that are willing to actually go into these areas of what it means to be human and what it means to be animal, what it means to be alive in this living world in crisis. this is how things change. This is how we actually, can possibly move into a brighter future.
Yeah, it does feel that this is a conversation that is of this time and really
Yeah.
important for this time. Yeah. So I would love to know how you got to where you are. Why are you doing this work? Why is this your passion?
Yeah, so it's been a process. I've been interested in this kind of work. I really think for my entire life, for as long as I can remember, I've been interested in very unusual things. My life, as I think is the case for a lot of neurodivergent people, has been a sort of series of obsessions from early childhood, topics that have just completely, taken a hold of me and, propelled me through life. And when I was very young, I was really interested. Some of the earliest obsessions or passions that I had were dogs. I was absolutely in love with my childhood dog, Star. Yeah, my book is actually dedicated to her.
Oh,
I was quite obsessed and interested in anything involved in sort of the world of the occult, the supernatural. I was giving tarot readings for my parents' friends in our living room and trying to summon ghosts and demons and various kinds of entities. I was always really interested in these sorts of things, and fortunate enough to have an environment where I could actually explore those. My parents were and still are at least nominally Christian. I came up in a very Christian environment, very, sort of Christian cultural context, but I was allowed to explore and to, sort of find my own voice and my own path in the sort of grand
mm,
marketplace of spirituality in the 21st, late 20th or early 21st century. So I was led down a lot of different pathways. I always say that my first sort of deep dive into the waters of enchantment really took place when my mother gave me a copy of J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit. It was a favorite from her childhood, and I had avoided reading it for a long time because I thought the title was silly. But then when I eventually read it, it completely changed my life. I read The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings and Silmarillion, and then everything else in due time. And that was really my first exposure to a deep and profound body of mythology that was well outside of the sort of cultural sphere that was normative for me, that, everyone else was sort of engaged in,
mm,
and that I never really felt at home in. I never felt that it was that profound. I never really cared about Jesus. I didn't believe in God. I didn't like a lot of what the churches represented in the world, even at a very young age. So this was my first sort of exposure to something else. And when I looked at that world that I had become so invested in versus the world that I was expected to live in, I couldn't go back. I couldn't
mm.
willfully return to a disenchanted sort of worldview that I was supposed to be living in. So I started looking for other sources of enchantment. I started looking in other religious traditions, feeling that religion was where I was going to find something real and serious that I could, sink my teeth into and dedicate myself to. And eventually I did find a religious tradition that really spoke to me. I shopped around a little bit, dabbled in neo-paganism. I had a moment where I was flirting with Catholicism because I thought the saints might be my like pathway into something more magical. It wasn't. But then I eventually read a book on Zen meditation, which got me into Buddhism. And then I learned about Tibetan Buddhism. And that was a real aha moment for me when I first encountered some works about Tibetan Buddhism and then some translations of texts from the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. I was absolutely enraptured by them. And I decided when
Mm.
I was 13 years old that I was a Tibetan Buddhist in the Nyingma tradition of Tibetan Buddhism. I had never met a Tibetan Buddhist in my life, or a Buddhist for that matter, really. But I knew that this was the tradition for me. And I was very fortunate to then, just a year later, when I was 14, I met a Lama in the Nyingma tradition of Tibetan Buddhism, who just happened to have a giant retreat center an hour away from my house in middle of
Mm.
nowhere, Colorado. So
Synchronicity right there.
it was absolutely insane. I tell the story of how I met her in some other places, but it was very, yeah, it was very happenstantial,
Mm.
and I felt very grateful to have had that because I then had a sort of spiritual home for 20 years. I
Wow.
spent a lot of time living at the center. I worked at the center. I received extensive training in Tibetan Buddhist ritual arts, studied all kinds of practices and philosophical traditions and texts and so on. I studied Tibetan language. I ultimately went on to complete a classical training in Tibetan medicine. I did that between 2012 and 2020. So I was really sort of fully immersed in that world. And it it is still something that's very important to me, but my relationship with it is very different from what it was. My relationship with religion as a whole is very different from what it was. I think I've gone through a certain sort of process of deconstruction from even this sort of chosen religion that I've been really deeply
Mm,
involved in for a long time, and into something that I think is a bit more organic and immanentist. And this is a lot of
mm.
this happened while I was writing Unseen Beings. A lot of it had been brewing for a while, and the book itself sort of ties together a lot of threads that have been weaving, around one another since childhood. Dogs are in it, Tolkien's in it, ghosts
Oh,
and
wow.
demons and
Mm.
spirits are in it, and there's a lot of Buddhist stuff and even Tibetan medical stuff in it. So I bring everything together in it. But that process of writing and researching this book really sort of helped me clarify, I think, what my fundamental values are as a spiritual person, as a spiritual teacher, practitioner in the world today. And a lot of that really comes back down to a more immanent approach to spirituality, a more pragmatic approach to spirituality,
Mm.
less of a transcendent approach focused on getting away from the world, getting away from nature, getting away from the planet and the beings that we share it with, and more turning towards it, turning into it, embracing our humanity and our animal nature in a more than human world. One of the through
Mm.
lines that I work with a lot academically and also professionally is nature spirits, is conceptions of nature spirits over time, the ideas surrounding them, how they integrate with ecological knowledge, also medical knowledge, mythological knowledge over time. And I think it's a really important topic, actually, and something that's unfortunately, as we were talking about earlier, I think mm, it's been renegotiated in a certain way in the modern world that I think is understandable, but arguably not so useful or not as useful as
Mm.
taking it really more at face value in a more traditional format. So Unseen Beings was my first sort of public foray into this space, but a lot of the work that I'm doing right now, including academic work and more public work, is really centered around this.
Mm. I love so much what you shared there. There was often notice how we, each of us that are kind of doing, I don't know how to describe this kind of broader work that, those of us like that sort of change maker type of person, this idea of, let's just call it enchantment, how we often either start without it, reclaim it, and then need to kind of find a way of like, how do I retain that worldview? How do I move even more deeply into that worldview in a world which is right now quite bereft of it?
Yeah.
Or some are more like my childhood, where I was very fortunate to kind of be born into an enchanted world. Um, where that was, I didn't know for the first, probably 5 years of my life that there was a world that wasn't enchanted. Like for me, this was the way that we all lived. And
Mm.
then I really like disenchanted myself. I thought that was like essential. I need to kind of grow up and, get real and be in the world
Yeah.
in a way that, works, which isn't enchantment. And
Yeah.
then have then kind of like come back into that enchantment. And I find this such an interesting way, like each of us will kind of like weave in and out of it. And I
Mm.
think in some ways it's those transition points when we're really consciously recognizing, oh, this is possible, this is what's here, this is what's in the way. We're learning really important things that, again, culturally, we're facing right now, whether we know
Yeah.
it or not.
Oh,
And some,
absolutely.
yeah, huge in that. There was one of the things that, as you may know, a lot of the work we do with people is really guiding them to become their medicine, whatever way is right for them, like give their gifts to the world. And I often say, as we serve our medicine, it teaches us.
Hmm.
And I really hear that in the writing of your book. You got to really understand, like, what is it you're really here to do, but you can only do that by already serving it. Like, you serve and learn, serve and learn, serve and learn.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's been a bit of a wild process because as I said, like I had all of these different paths that emerged over time, many that emerged quite organically, and they were always there. They were always the natural sources of enchantment for me, but my relationship with them was very complicated, especially having, a form of mythology, which is not religious, be at really the core of my identity as a
Mm,
person. I was teased relentlessly about it as a kid. The Tolkien stuff really, that did not do me any favors as a a young, very queer boy coming up in a hyper masculine and not very accepting society in that regard. And also ultimately deciding, kind of like what you were saying, that I had to disenchant myself to a certain extent, or I defined a real form of enchantment that I could justify, that
mm,
could be serious, that I could actually, engage with without it being taken as some sort of ridiculous thing. And that's what religion ultimately gave me. Religion was a space where you can
mm.
believe all kinds of nonsense and you can do all kinds of silly things and believe in all kinds of beings and myths and stories, and
So
it can be
true.
taken very seriously. We're not
Mm,
allowed to challenge any of that, or disrespect any of that. So that became a more respectable sort of space for that to
mm.
exist in. And I think as
Irony is
I exactly. And I think maturation for me has really involved fully embracing, what does enchantment look like for me, and being able to really pay attention to that, to embrace, yeah, that the medicine that's, been sort of with me all along, that I
mm,
kept trying to sort of shy away from and replace with something more respectable. But nature spirits are a great example of this, especially in Buddhism, in modern 20th, 21st century Buddhism, especially in the sort of global and largely Western sorts of varieties. There's a tendency to create this stark division between the transcendent, soteriological, sort of elevated forms of spirituality in
mm,
Buddhism, and Buddhist practice focused on individual liberation, even if it involves a lot of magic and manifestation as deities and mantras and incantations and so on, versus the sort of cultural supernatural stuff that people tend to throw out with the bathwater. And nature
mm,
spirits usually end up in the latter. And
mm,
that's not due to traditional prejudices. That's not due because throughout history Buddhists have always sort of considered the nature spirit stuff to be secondary. It's really a Western prejudice that we think that, well, nature is disenchanted. Nature is just inert and mechanical and this sort of, just background for human activity. So that stuff isn't something that we should take very seriously. And I think that
mm,
that divide is really dangerous because it's just reinforcing this binary sort of division between humanity and nature. And that creates a lot of problems. I argue in my book that that's really at the foundations of the Anthropocene and of our environmental crises that we're
mm,
facing right now. So we have to tear down that wall, and we have to really allow ourselves to embrace some of that natural magic because it is rational. This is a point that we can come back to in a minute, but I mean, it is fundamentally rational to believe that non-human beings and the non-human environment is a source of sentience and agency and wonder and magic and relationship. But it's also highly pragmatic that we view it in such a way, because then it gives us the ability to really negotiate these complex relations between human and non-human beings in a living world.
mm. Yeah, it's funny, it really is hitting me more deeply than ever how those of us that are, to whatever extent, some way down this path of recognizing um, what we're talking about here, the reality of nature spirits, the reality of non-human beings. Um, I think again, because often we're coming at it from still with some level of that modern worldview intact, there is just it naturally creates this sense of like objectification and hierarchy and
Mm,
ultimately disconnection that we're just
Yeah,
not recognizing is there. It goes unaddressed because we're not seeing it, because it looks, compared to how most of the world is going on, it looks as though we have that connection. Isn't quite the right word, even. It's deeper than that, but it's like, oh, compared to how most people are relating to the world around us, I'm coming from a place of, like, so much more intimacy and connection. Yes, and yet it still has that disconnection, that objectification at its roots.
absolutely.
And I'm yeah, and it's I'd love to I'd love to know your sense as to, given given that worldview for most of us is, it's been there from the time that we kind of first started to become conscious. We've been indoctrinated, to use a word I think you used earlier, indoctrinated in that worldview where we are very human centered.
Mm.
How do you see that we go about dismantling that, to even I guess to even first of all recognize it's there?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the recognition of it is complicated. It's difficult to see anthropocentrism because it's so ingrained in our cultural mindset that we just assume that it's a given, that we
Mm,
further assume everyone has taken as a given. There's this sort of implicit assumption that humans, of course, were anthropocentric because we're humans. All humans must have been anthropocentric,
mm,
just like we think that all humans must have believed in nature. And that's a very simple idea that's
mm.
actually incredibly
Yes.
complicated, and
Mm,
we don't really think about it in a critical way because it's a part of the lens through which we view reality, and we assume that was the case for everyone. But this idea of nature as a single univocal sort of undifferentiated external domain of non-human beings, which is in eternal opposition to human culture and humanity, that's a Western idea, and it's a fairly recent one,
mm,
actually. The concept of nature from Latin natura is very old, but in the earliest context, it just referred to the nature of a thing. Our use of nature in the way that we talk about it today, we want to save nature, preserve nature, heal nature, return to nature, visit nature, unite with nature, all of that. That use of the word nature is just in the Enlightenment era and later. This is just over the past
mm,
few hundred years that we've had this idea of nature. And with that idea of nature came all of these concepts, including its, mechanical qualities. Nature is like a clock. It's a bunch of interlocking parts that are sort of working together like a machine. We think of nature as a storehouse of resources. That's a very important one. And we generally think
mm,
of nature as being a realm of instinct and mechanism as opposed to a realm of agency and intelligence. And this
mm.
ties into even the study of ecology, which was originally called economy, which is now a slightly different idea, but closely linked, because both of these are really dealing with the study of household resources. Even the word eco, it comes from Greek ekos, oikos, which means the home. It means the house, and these are our
Ah,
household resources.
mm,
So we have to really get a bit beneath all of that. We have to recognize the historical development of these ideas, where they come from. We have to critically analyze them on a rational basis. Does it really make sense for us to relate to all non-human others as a resource? Probably not. And then how do we get beyond it? Once we've sort of analyzed the cause of our problem, once we've looked at the etiology of our disease, I think the way to get out of it really begins with storytelling. It begins with telling different kinds of stories. Mythology is
mm,
it's impossible to overstate the importance of mythology in forming our worldviews and thus creating the worlds that we actually live in. So we need to tell new stories. We need to tell not even necessarily new stories. We need to tell old stories in many cases, but we
mm,
have to engage with them more critically, more intelligently. We need to sort of get behind the driver's seat to a certain extent so we can really see what stories we're telling and how that's shaping the worlds that we live in. We need to become a bit more involved in the process instead of just, sort of taking whatever we're told on face value. Um, So it's a
Mm,
complicated process, but I do think that it's twofold. That we need a historical understanding of how we got in this situation, of where our ideas come from. Where does the idea of nature come from? Where do the ideas of spirits in the conventional sense come from? Where does the idea of devils and demons come from? How did these ideas arise in our cultural consciousness in the specific cultures in which they exist? Recognizing that they do not exist everywhere, and that it's been very
mm,
specific cultures that have developed these ideas and then forced them upon the rest of the world, usually through processes like forced conversion and proselytizing and colonization and genocide, cultural
mm.
and literal. So we have to see the historical side, and then if we really want to heal, if we want to recover, we have to begin with the stories that we tell and the ways that we live based on those stories.
Mm. There's a real synchronicity in that. I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but we are, by the time this episode goes out, we would have rebranded, rebirthed as Be Mythical. So this very
Oh,
podcast
great.
will be
Cool.
renamed
I love that.
the Be Mythical podcast. And it very much is, there's a few different lenses and I guess facets of that, what we're meaning when we're talking about being mythical. There's an aspect of that that's very much like living your own myth, but
Hmm.
also really that kind of animating what it means to live in a way that honors the
Yeah,
myths, the ancient myths, that mythical worldview. And it's only really I see from there that we can live our own myth. It
totally.
requires kind of like deepening into that worldview that is just, again, we we barely even know exists in our
Yeah.
modern world. And it really is like you're saying, it's kind of not just kind of telling different stories, but it's like living them, being
Yeah.
immersed in that different way of seeing the world, seeing ourselves.
I mean, isn't it wild that like this was the backbone of human civilization, of human
Mm,
societies for really, I mean, tens of thousands of years, that's hundreds of thousands of years. This has
mm,
been at the core of what it means to be human. This has been, the sort of central axis, the axis mundi around which our human societies have developed. And now we've completely changed our relationship with stories and with myth. And I think that that's, that stagnation, which has been a big theme in the evolution of religion and religious traditions as they've existed over, especially the past couple thousand years. This stagnation is really reflected in our world, in our inability to remain flexible in the ways that we relate with the living world and the non human beings around us and with one
mm,
another. And we have to break free of that because we are able to. We are not fixed as human beings to any singular trajectory. We're not constantly ascending towards, some sort of perfection and progressive sort of peak humanity, and we're not infinitely regressing into some sort of terrible, barbaric, primitivity in the negative sense. We're constantly flexible. We're constantly changing and evolving and
mm,
taking in new ideas and renegotiating our values and our ways of living, and there are endless possibilities. So, in order to really reclaim that, we have to engage in this realm, this domain of myth. And I think that can take many forms. Fantasy itself is, I think, a very, very, very important.
mm,
Creative art form. In a similar way that science fiction is very important in a technological era where we're on the threshold, just passing the threshold of like AI technology, and this
mm,
explosion of this form of technological development that's going to completely upend our entire ways of constructing human societies. We have to grapple with that. We have to deal with that. We have to metabolize it, and we need to do it before it happens. We need to start experimenting with
mm,
different possibilities so that we can be emotionally and socially sort of present for it and capable of dealing with it. And science fiction is the best method that we have of experimenting with those ideas in a sort of sandbox. I think in the same way, fantasy gives us the ability to have some of those same kinds of conversations, not in a technological sphere, but in an environmental sphere, looking at our relationships with non-human beings. Ursula Le Guin once said, in what I think is the best encapsulation of this point, she says, "What fantasy can do that the realistic novel generally cannot do is include the non-human as essential." And that for me is
mm,
really that is the point. almost every serious drama, whether it's a film or a TV series or a book or what have you, a story that someone tells. In the modern world, serious drama, serious stories center entirely around the human. Non-humans are not main
Mm.
characters. They're props and set pieces and maybe, sort of side points that teach us something about what it means to be human, but they're not featured as characters themselves. The only real literary form or storytelling form that we have today that allows for that kind of space is what we call fantasy. And I think that for
Yeah.
that reason, it's arguably the most important artistic form for the world today, for our Anthropocenic sort of apocalyptic world that we're in, because it gives us the ability to consider the perspectives of non-human beings, environments, the spirits of a place, the planet itself, in a very dynamic, emotional, and social way.
Mm. Wow, that there's so much here that's um I'll share from a personal perspective. One of my, how you were describing the impact of The Hobbit on you. I've read, so much fantasy as a child, but it was particularly the Narnia series that was the one that I had such it's actually, I can feel the emotion rising now. There was a real
Mm,
heart connection, and I'm seeing that again through new eyes. I hear listening to what you're saying. I'm like, oh, no wonder it had the effect it had on me.
yeah,
It was, yeah, it spoke to so many of the things you're talking about here, and I agree. I think there is. I mean, even still, we're going to again bring our disconnected worldview to it, but it is like an invitation into being in a different way in relationship to these things. We touched on this. I can't remember if we were recording when we were talking about this earlier, where I think I notice as we start to have a conscious relationship with non-human beings, we can do it in a way, and maybe this is needed for a time. We can do it in a way where we're kind of seeing it more as a metaphor, like
yeah,
it's not really real.
yeah,
It has efficacy. I'm doing this for a reason, but still, there's part of me that knows it's just,
yeah,
it's not actually this way. It's a metaphor. It's a
right.
helpful symbol. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that because for me, that's it is again, sometimes that can be a stepping stone, but there's a point at which we need to become conscious of that too.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I go back to Tolkien on this because he talked about this extensively. The difference between allegory and applicability in mythopoeic fantasy and storytelling of this caliber, which of course C.S. Lewis was, one of Tolkien's dearest friends for many years. They were co-inklings in Oxford and worked together quite a bit, especially while they were developing their own bodies of work. And there's a big difference between allegory and applicability. Allegory is structured in such a way that it's really pointing to one specific thing, and it's the author who has complete control over what's being indicated. The story itself is in the process sort of stripped of its own ability to enchant because you know that it's false. It's a
Mm,
false world, it's a false story that's contrived for the purpose of pointing to a particular thing. And not only that, but telling the author's perspective on that particular thing. Animal
mhm.
Farm isn't about a bunch of animals living on a farm. And,
Ah,
it
yes.
cannot
Mhm.
enchant us into that experience of non-human intelligence or animal intelligence because that's not what it's about. That's not what the story is designed to do. It's designed as an allegory. It's designed to point to
Mm,
something else. And Tolkien explained that the opposite of this is applicability. It's telling a story that's really more foundational. It's not being overlaid onto reality and pointing to so-called, primary world reality. It's more foundational to the point that we can then take our own lived experiences, whatever they may be, whatever context we might find ourselves in, whatever, time or place we might be in, we can take our own lives and we can project that back onto the stories themselves. It can be applied to our lives in a much more dynamic sort of way.
mm,
And that is something that can only really happen if the story itself is treated as not necessarily sacred, because the great benefit of fantasy literature and mythology that's outside of the bounds of religion is you don't have to believe it for it to be effective. You don't have to believe in its historicity in order for it to be treated as something that's really kind of sacrosanct and intrinsically true in a sense. So it's the opposite is this applicability, which still provides truth, but it provides it on its own terms. That is what it's pointing to. The story of Frodo with the ring, that is what the story of Frodo and the ring is about. It's about that world and that story, which is our world. Middle Earth isn't a different world. It's the old Germanic, term for our Earth, the Middle Earth, between the upper world and the lower world, and within the encircling oceans. But this is, yeah, it's really flipping that. I actually pulled a quote because I had anticipated that this might come up. There's a great quote that Tolkien has in an essay called On Fairy Stories, which I recommend that anyone and everyone read. It's quite short. It's brilliant. It's one of his best academic essays on the history and the nature and the function of fairy stories, of these deep sort of mythopoeic tales. And he explains that at one time it was a dominant view that all such matter was derived from nature myths. The Olympians were personifications of the sun, of dawn, of night, and so on. And all the stories told about them were originally myths. Allegories would have been a better word, of the greater elemental changes and processes of nature. He goes on to say, that would seem to be the truth almost upside down. And he explains that indeed, instead of thinking of Poseidon as being the personification of the ocean, we can think of the ocean as being the physicalization of Poseidon, viewing Poseidon as the primary phenomenon, the essential phenomenon. Bruno Latour talks about this as well, that animation is the essential phenomenon. De-animation is the secondary, auxiliary, and often polemical position, which doesn't have a lot of real, legitimate sort of rational basis to it. Another great example is like a tree. We can talk about tree spirits as being a sort of personification of a tree. But in reality, what is a nature spirit if not just a living tree? It's accepting fully the beingness, the personhood of a tree itself. Instead of viewing a tree as an object, you're recognizing the person that is within that embodied biological experience. So I really like the way that he frames that, because there is a degree of, a relationship between the mythic symbols, the mythic archetypes, and the real world phenomena. But the relationship is almost upside down in our minds. We think that nature is disenchanted, and that's the rational truth. And then we have to project some sort of enchantment and magic onto it to give it personhood. We think that personhood is only assigned by humans because we are the fundamental persons. But that's really not the case. These stories and myths give us the ability to recognize the personhood of many different kinds of beings, biological and non-biological, and gives us the space to be able to engage with them relationally, which otherwise wouldn't be possible because of our disenchantment.
Goodness, that's so rich. There's so much there. It was bringing to mind one of the very first practices we tend to invite our students into, which is to create a relationship with a tree.
Yeah.
And we don't give huge amounts of kind of instruction in that. It's just like, how to create relationships, find a tree, go do that. And it was just occurring to me how that then happens in such an organic way where that you really do see the being that is the tree.
Yeah.
There is, and it's not from this objectified lens of kind of, this is oak and it's here for me to, like, it is literally a relationship with the tree.
Exactly.
That tree that, one of my kind of key relationships in terms of trees is an oak that's at the top of a hill local to me. And I have been, this is, years, I've gone to that tree on a very regular basis. And it's beyond anything I could kind of like sum up as like, oh, this is this is the oak or this is the tree, because
Yeah.
it's a living, breathing relationship with
Right.
another being. And I was just feeling like it's the possibility for that. We're surrounded by it, but we have to kind of like enter it from a different place. We have to like
Absolutely.
be humble enough to like enter it from that kind of place where we don't know. We can't project our ideas of what it is, for a tree to be a tree or an oak to be,
Right.
the tree to be a representation of oak spirit. Like we don't know. Like we have to
Exactly.
enter it not knowing.
Exactly. I mean, that's really where the magic is. That's where enchantment is. Enchantment is a fundamentally
Mm,
relational experience. It's what happens when at a meeting of minds, when you really encounter the beingness
yes.
of an other, whether it's a human,
Mm,
whether it's a lover or a friend or a child or a teacher, or whether it's a pet, so-called pet, where it's one of our animal companions, or if it's with a plant or with a microbe or with a fungus. There are so many possibilities. But those moments of connection, those moments of authentic relationship, that's where the magic really comes from. It's
mm,
in recognizing and embracing the other, and just embracing them on their own terms, not trying to understand them for the purposes of exploiting them or utilizing them or manipulating them into serving your purposes. It's really just about meeting them as an other, as a being, as a fellow person, as a fellow traveler in our world, and just being in that connection.
mm,
That's the foundation of existence. That's the foundation of what it means to be alive. And it's essential that we find ways to recapture that and recover that sense of relationality. And like you said, not reducing all others to this sort of you know strictly sort of archetypal nature. Not that archetypes are not
mm,
useful. I think archetypes are very useful, especially archetypes that help us make sense of our own human position in a more than human world. But I do think it's
mm.
quite dangerous to reduce non-humans to archetypes, especially when they're real beings. They're real actual beings.
Yes.
Plants
Mm,
are it's now becoming more evident in modern Western science that this is the case. We didn't think it was for a long time. Folks like Aristotle and Plato and later Descartes and so on, they were absolutely convinced that not only are plants not really sentient, but non-human animals aren't really sentient. They were convinced that dogs
mm,
are not really sentient beings. They're just biological machines that are, sort of pre-programmed by a creator with all of these instincts. But we humans are the only ones with real sentience and agency. This is absurd. There's no legitimate scientist worth their degrees that are saying this. No one believes that.
mm.
But people, the public still by and large buy into these sorts of ideas because it's pragmatic, especially given the ways that we treat animals and plants and the non-human environment in our world. But it's essential that we go beyond that. A hawk is not a
Mm.
symbol for anything about humanity. They're not a symbol of what it means to be human or any element of our humanness. And they weren't that for for the humans of the past, and not just of the past, the humans of pre-modern and non-modern worldviews. They were actual beings that people were in relationship with, and they might
Mm.
provide certain forms of medicine. They might provide certain insights and certain wisdoms, certain learnings as teachers and guides, and again fellow travelers in the world. They might even provide nourishment, but each of them are a form of relationship. Even
Mm.
violence in traditional cultures towards non-human beings, which obviously has always been present, that violence is negotiated as a form of relationship, not as a form of
Yes.
exploitation
Mm.
by sentient beings towards non-sentient objects. And that's the switch that we absolutely have to make. I think especially in sort of environmentalist circles. I think it's really
Mm.
problematic, for instance, that we talk so much about sustainability without ever questioning what it is we're trying to sustain. That's a
Mm.
little like one of those things that when you the thought first sort of crosses your mind, you're like,
Mm.
oh, what are we trying to sustain?
Yeah.
Oh, it's exploitation. That's what this is all about. We don't want to
Oh my
stop the
goodness,
exploitation.
yeah. Mm. Oh my gosh. Yeah. And it's oh, I just had so many different ideas and strands of this coming as you were talking there. And I was like, it's on the one hand, we've got people who are, again, really genuinely have passion and really well intentioned and wanting to protect and preserve the environment. Um, and then the other hand, we might have people again who are like starting to step foot into a kind of more, let's say, animistic worldview, shamanic
Yeah,
worldview. But I think both, it's like there is something deeper available to us. And again, it goes back to this idea of, not even an idea, but like relationship. I was
yeah,
thinking of how many times, and again, this is not intended at all as a kind of making wrong or shaming, but I really understand it can land like this, where I'll be working with a group, let's say, and then someone will say, "Oh, I saw a fox earlier. What does fox mean?" And there's
right,
like this knee-jerk kind of, like, what is that symbol of a fox? And
yeah,
and like, Google what does fox spirit mean? And not to make any of that, again, this isn't about shaming that, making that wrong, but more to recognize like it's a stepping stone
mm,
back into something that lies far beyond that. And again, it's not to say, sometimes, again, I absolutely adore symbols and archetypes. There's
yeah,
like, so much value, so much magic there, and not everything is just that. And if we're
yeah,
stopping there, this is fox, this is fox spirit, what is it there for me? It just totally gets in the way of actually having a relationship with that fox, if
yeah,
it's available to have a relationship with us.
yeah,
And again, not to say that that's wrong and like shouldn't happen. I think it is more a transitional stage, and to notice like, oh, okay, that might be the first steps back into a real relationship. But just notice, like, if we stop there, we're stopping actually having a relationship. It's like
yeah,
seeing another human and say, like, that's a human. What does a human symbolize? And then like,
right.
okay, job done. There's nothing more there.
Precisely. And we do this, I
Mm,
mean, we do this all the time. This is the foundation of a lot of our different systems of prejudice and, the taxonomies that we apply to different humans. We assume
mm.
usually that those outside of our group are
So
reducible to a
true.
certain set
Yes.
of stock
Mm,
characteristics. And that is, the foundation of racism, the belief in race, the belief that
mm.
human beings are divisible into these different, sort of subspecies. That was developed by, the sort of scientific, pseudoscientific, but the scientific approach to human races was established by Carl Linnaeus. He's the same one that we get our Latin binomial system for identifying animals and plants. He's the same guy. He's the one that thought, oh, humans also. We have, these four major human
Mhm.
races, and each one has their own set of stock characteristics, except, of course, conveniently, the white race, which predominantly has, many different, much more multiplicitous
Mhm.
possibilities, and then all these abilities for transcendence and wisdom and knowledge and da 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 da. But everyone else is reducible to a set of stock characteristics, and that's what they are. That's what they represent. And this ideology is really what gets us stuck in these hierarchies. It's what gets us stuck in these master identity complexes where we think that there's one group of beings, specifically humans, usually
Mhm.
white male humans, that are in a position that's above and separate from everyone else, and thus bequeathed with the privilege of being in
Mhm.
control of everyone else and being able to exploit everyone else with impunity. We have to be really critical, obviously, of those notions applied to humans, but we do need to recognize the commonalities underlying human-based systems of taxonomic prejudice and the ways that those get extended into the non-human world, because they're not
Mhm.
entirely different. Anyone that has, I'm looking at my cat. I just want to show up my cat. That's my cat's current position. Very sweet, sweet kitty. But I have two cats, and anyone that's had animal companions, especially more than one, they're not the same. I have two cats,
Mm.
and they're sisters. They were litter mates. They have entirely different personalities. They don't represent one cat archetype. They're not a
Mm.
symbol of anything in particular. They are individual persons. They're beings with their own experience of reality, their own desires, their own needs, their own perspectives, and that's what it means to be alive, is to be in relationship with many different
Mm.
beings that are in their own experiences. So I really, and that, you mentioned animism, and that's, if I were to identify my sort of spiritual orientation, in this time right now, it's certainly animistic. That is, fundamentally, I think, the worldview that everyone needs to come back to. It's not a belief system. It's not a religion. It's not a fixed system of dogma or doctrine. There are no prescribed beliefs or ceremonies you have to perform to be an animist. There are countless ways to express an animistic worldview. But animism at its core is simply a recognition that the world is full of persons and very few of those persons are human. And we are in
Mm,
relationship with all of those beings. That's what it means to be alive. That's what it means to be a person in a complex and diverse world. And I think that that's really what a lot of people want to get back to. I find that when a lot of people talk about shamanism, which is, that's a whole other conversation. But when they talk about shamanism, a lot of people fundamentally, what they're meaning is animism. What they're wanting to get
mm,
back to is an animistic worldview because it's primordial. It's foundational. It's primitive, not in the sense that it's antiquated and archaic and irrational. It's primitive in the sense that it is foundational to what it means to be alive. That is the
mm,
basic way of experiencing the world, is recognizing that just because these other beings don't look like me or they aren't me, that doesn't mean that they're not alive. And that recognition is as old as time. It's certainly as old as our species, but I would argue that it goes way beyond that. And any being that is embodied in this world, it behooves them to recognize that they are not alone. That is the
mm,
most pragmatic way to live. And I think that's what we're really trying to get back to, is a recognition of the diversity of beingness, the continuity of being that underlies all of our different myriad experiences. And if we can just get back to that space, then many things can be built out of that. You can retain many aspects of a spiritual path, of shamanic methods of engagement, of religious methods of engagement, of, pragmatic social methods of engagement, but they can take place on an animistic basis. We can start from the basic recognition that we're not alone. We've never been alone. We will never be alone. And our whole world arises from these relationships, these interconnections.
mm. I love this so much. I really do. It brings to mind a conversation I had on the show maybe a year ago, where we were talking about animism, and the guest said something that was one of those, like, such a simple thing that I thought I already kind of knew, but it hit me so deeply. I realized, like, oh my goodness, there was still a kind of gap where it hadn't, like, fully entered my being. And he said something along the lines of, animism is the innate human worldview. And it was when he said innate, it was like, oh my goodness, this, like, the truth just kind of like
Mm.
resonated through me, where I think it actually like took my like breath and my words away for a moment, where I just like sat there and it's like, that's true. And it's not innate. It is innate in the perspective, as like you're saying, this is our original worldview. This is the worldview that humans have had for, like, 90+% of human history. But it's actually innate, right? Like, as in, we're born
Yeah,
with it. We
yeah,
have to be conditioned out of it, but it's still there. It's still there to
exactly.
return to. It's innate. It's like our worldview that is there for us naturally. And it's about returning to that for
Exactly.
ourselves as modern humans. It's not, we don't have to reclaim it from the past. It's actually what we are
Yeah.
born with.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think it's a very important point. We have to teach kids not to believe that animals are
Yes.
sentient. Like, we have to really indoctrinate them into that
Mm,
way of viewing the world. And it is also, I mean, historically speaking, that is also the case. I mean, animism, to the best of our knowledge, it predates the existence of or the ideas of deities. It predates ancestor veneration. It predates beliefs in an afterlife.
mm,
Humans have had an animistic perception of the world longer than we've had any of the other features of what we think of as religion. And this is something that Edward Tyler was the first to sort of posit, father of anthropology, very problematically, because he viewed it as a primitive sort of delusion that then snowballed
mm,
into all of these religious ideas that took us away from reality. But the modern sort of new animistic approach is that, yes, it is the oldest. It's the oldest sort of, worldview that humans humans have had, but it wasn't a delusion. That was the natural state.
Yes,
That was the healthy state of
it's
balance that we have
true.
tried to get away from. And not all of us have gotten away from it. There's countless traditions
Mm,
around the world, even today, that are still fundamentally animistic, that take as a given that there are non-human beings with whom we share the world, and it is our
mm,
responsibility to be in relationship with them. Whatever form that relationship might take, it's still our responsibility to negotiate our relationships with them in a careful way and to bring them into our consideration of things like ethics and social values and so on. So it's innate, it is fundamental, and it's also innate in every single moment. We feel it in us, and I think that having animal companions in our lives is really important, especially for young people, especially for
mm,
kids, because it gives us the ability, hopefully early on, to recognize the personhood of non-humans and to develop a sense of love for them and to recognize the love that they feel for us. I think dogs,
mm,
especially, I talk about dogs in my book. They've been with us for tens of thousands of years longer than any other animals that we've so-called
mm,
domesticated. They came to us, we joined together, and they really domesticated themselves to an extent. But that was a collaboration between hunters. It was a collaboration between living beings in a living world. They were our kin, they were our friends, they were our family members.
mm,
We seem to have believed that they had an afterlife just as we did for a very long time. That's been a concept humans have had. They're a perfect sort of gateway,
mm.
which is fun, given the fact that dogs have always been a gateway between the human and the
Yeah.
human world and the other world. But they really
Mm,
are a sort of gateway relationship that can break us into this experience of really being in radical companionship, radical sociality, society with non-human beings, and a collective with
mm,
non-humans. And it enriches our lives. It makes us more capable to deal with the ethical dilemmas of the Anthropocene and the challenges posed by our environmental crises and climate crises, etc. But it also makes us more fulfilled. It gives us, a greater quality of life. We're miserable.
mm,
Humans are, a lot of humans are not happy. We're dealing with really fundamental ailments, fundamental dis-ease in our modern human societies. And a very important piece of our treatment, an important piece of our therapy, is recognizing that we're not alone and embracing those relationships. I think especially
mm,
as spiritual practitioners, this is why I think it's so important for folks that are on a spiritual path of some kind to really come into these kinds of conversations and allow this to really impact the way that you approach spirituality, because we're trying to get there. We're already in that process. We've
yes.
taken the first steps in doing that. We've gotten to the threshold of enchantment, and maybe we've caught glimpses of it, but we need to just allow ourselves to go into it fully without any of the shame or any of the fear of, oh, this is just superstitious nonsense. It isn't. Science indicates that it's not absurd for us to think that the so-called environment is very much alive and sentient and animate. That is the
Mm,
rational conclusion, and that's what our ancestors have been saying for almost the entirety of our human history.
mm. Yeah. What we're talking about here about animism versus, say, shamanism. And again, they can be, I guess sometimes we can collapse them. And even though my own practice is shamanism, I really do feel that having that clarity of like they're not one and the same thing. And it's actually animism that really what we're talking about here. And again, going back to that worldview, I was just reflecting that I was fortunate enough in my training. My teacher is a British shaman, but his kind of like teachers that were kind of like co-teachers in a way for my training are Mexican indigenous group, the Wirakuta, and unbroken lineage that goes back, thousands of years.
Hmm.
And as you were talking, I was thinking, whilst I have this, real gratitude and appreciation for what I've been fortunate enough to learn from them in terms of those shamanic practices, really, it's not the greatest blessing was that seeing that, as you say, that real world, real life, moment to moment expression of an animist worldview, like
Yeah,
how that is just how everything is done. Like it is almost like,
yeah,
yes, it's done when it comes to the shamanic practices, but it's just a way of living, a way of being in relationship to all the beings. The corn, for example, is a really
yeah,
important aspect of their relationship. And all of these are relationships. And it's that actually that for me has been the biggest blessing, far more than the shamanic practices. It is
yeah.
really that relationship to non-human beings.
Totally. And that's something that is open to everyone. It's our birthright. That is a fundamental feature of what it is to be alive. We all have the ability to engage with that. Shamanism is a series of, or a sort of method of engagement, of profession in a sense. It's a specialization within an animistic world. Not
Mm,
everyone is called to be a shaman. Not everyone needs to be a shaman. We need shamans. We need shamanic practitioners. We need folks to carry on those traditions, those forms of ritual engagement and ceremony and storytelling and so on. But not everyone has to do that. Absolutely everyone can be an animist. You can be
mm,
a rational, secular scientist and an animist. You can be a hyper religious person with a very clear set of religious, beliefs and practices, and you can be an animist. You can be just a seeker and not really sure what you believe. That's fine. It's not about belief. But animism is the fundamental sort of the most foundational way of experiencing the world, and it is our birthright. It comes in, as soon as we come into it, into reality in this world as a living being of any form. It is our right to engage with other beings and to recognize their beingness. It gives us a great deal of fulfillment. It makes life worth living. It's a fundamental part of what makes life worth living. And I think that point is really, really important, that, we are blessed to still live in a world where there are some unbroken animistic traditions that are
mm,
still being practiced, that there are still wisdom holders that have escaped the fires and been able to carry on these traditions. It's vital that we recognize how perilous and precarious that position is, because there are countless societies and individuals that were not spared that fate. In the first 100 years
mm,
of European colonization of the Americas, 50 million indigenous American people were killed. 50 million in just the first 100 years of American colonization. In the witch trials throughout Europe, there was around 40,000 people that were burned at the stake, most of them women, most of them older women that people just wanted to do away with for any number of reasons.
mm,
Most of them were not engaged in any sort of animistic practices or magical practices or whatever. It was just misogyny. It was just femicide. That's
mm.
fundamentally what the witch trials were. But, there were certainly, especially in, like my ancestors in the far north of Scandinavia, the Sami, hundreds of Sami were burned at the stake with their drums because they refused to bow to the sort of, overarching, domination of Christianity. This has been happening for a very long time. Colonization, cultural erasure, cultural genocide has had a toll. It's taken a toll not only on human beings and their own lives, killing them in a very literal way. We've also, we, European societies for a very long time, European Christian societies especially, have taken a vested interest in destroying any systems of knowledge that run contrary to this exploitative anthropocentric view that has acted as the foundation for modern society. It was deemed important not only to silence people and to kill them if they are sort of running afoul of the system, but also to completely eliminate their systems of knowledge. Even in Western classical traditions of Latin literature, literature written in Latin, we only have 1% of all of the literature that was composed in Latin, because the vast majority of it, 99% of it, was destroyed mostly by Christians in the early years of the Common Era, because they were heretical and they wanted to clear the slate and cleanse it of any sort of heresy or any alternative ideas about the nature of things. We have to recognize that legacy. It's been a concerted effort to try to destroy these lineages of wisdom. So the fact that there are still some that exist, we should be incredibly grateful for that, and we should
Mm,
also be really careful with the ways that we engage with them. And I think
mm,
especially when we sort of assume that it operates like religion, that it's like you learn this one system and then that's your system and that's your whole world and that one's true and everyone else is wrong. And then you can take this one system from this one place and take it to an entirely different location, different culture, different world, different, ecology, different environment, and use it in the exact same way. That's really sort of divorcing animism from its relational basis and turning
Yes.
it into dogma.
Mm.
And there's a moment in a film that I saw not so long ago that I think perfectly encapsulates this. I've mentioned this in a couple of other places, but I think it perfectly gets it. It's in a film called The Truffle Hunters. It's an Italian film, a documentary about truffle hunters in Piemonte, near Turin. And it's these older men who go out with their dogs, and they find truffles, and these truffles are worth a lot of money, but this is their lifestyle. They live these very sort of rugged, salt of the earth kinds of people. And there's this great scene that takes place in this older man's kitchen, and it's this old truffle hunter and a truffle dealer who makes his living going to truffle hunters, buying their truffles and selling them with a high markup to restaurants. And the dealer's talking to the truffle hunter, and he says, listen, you're old, you're going to die soon, you have no kids, and you're one of the best truffle hunters in the region. Will you please take me with you to your spots? Will you show me where the truffle spots are that you get these incredible truffles from? And the old man says, no. I'm not going to do that. Absolutely not. I'll tell you what I will do, go get a dog, a good dog. Actually, not even a good dog. Just get a dog. And I'll go with you to one of your spots or to a place where neither of us have been before. And I'll show you how I do it. I'll sort of show you the process. I'll help you along. I'll accompany you. And the truffle dealer says, no, but you know where the good truffles are. You know all the right spots. If you had a kid, you would tell him where all the truffle spots are. And the man says, no, absolutely not. I would not do that. This is the way to learn. You get a dog, I'll go with you and we'll do it that way, or I'm not going to do it at all. And I think that moment really beautifully encapsulates the ways that we, I think, especially as Europeans, as white Europeans, should be in relationship with these wisdom holders. If they have any wisdom that they're willing to impart, if they're willing to bring us into our world and show us how to engage with it more meaningfully and more deeply, then we should take that opportunity with gratitude and with a great deal of what's the word I'm looking for? Not modesty.
Humility.
Exactly. But to think that what the process is to go and just appropriate someone else's place, someone else's system, someone else's process wholesale without applying any of our own, nuances to it or adapting it to our own lives. I think that that's really a foolish way to do things. We need to become much more pragmatic,
Yes.
much more nuanced, and really look at the world as if what they're saying is true knowledge, not like some sort of circle dance that we can learn and then mimic and dress up in their garb. That's not what it's about. That's not what animism is about. That's not really what spirituality is about, as far as I'm concerned.
Yes, I could not agree more. It's something that, again, I've been so fortunate to have teachers that shone the way on this, but very clearly my practice is British shamanism. It's based on relationships with the beings of this land.
Yeah.
This land, and anything I do is in relationship to this land, the beings of this land.
Yeah.
And if they're willing to work with me, they will show me. And I think it's to approach everything we do, like the truffle hunter, whether it's shamanism, truffle hunting, or whatever else, from that place. I
Yeah.
think we then start to have, again, the basis of a real relationship.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
We are sadly out of time. This is certainly a conversation. I can feel like the passion in us is like we could just keep going and going, but perhaps we'll come
100%.
back and do a part 2 sometime instead. Where can listeners find out more about you and your wonderful work?
They can, well, of course, there is Unseen Beings, How We Forgot the World is More Than Human, which is available everywhere. And I definitely recommend that folks read that. There's also an audiobook, which I read. So if you've enjoyed listening to my voice for an hour, then you can listen to it for even more hours on your favorite audiobook platform. There's also my website, shrimala.com, shrimala.com, that has a lot of various offerings, consultations, tutoring services, workshops, courses. And there's also some more media interviews at erikjampa.com, ERIKJAMPA.com. I do have a lot of stuff coming up this year. Which is sort of constantly evolving and building. So there will be more, links to events and workshops and opportunities for engagement on those websites. Definitely, folks should sign up to my mailing list if they want to be the first to know about things. I'm not the most disciplined about sending out emails, but I'm trying to get better. So it would be
Like the
great to have folks in
honesty.
there. There's a lot in the works. Hopefully this year especially, there's some projects that I have brewing that I'm quite excited about, and having interest and support from people is greatly appreciated. So hope to see people there.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much, Erik. This has
Oh, thank
been
you.
such a delight.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
I very much hope you enjoyed watching that. And if you did and you're not already subscribed, then do hit that bell thingy and subscribe to automatically get each fresh new episode as it's released each week. If you'd like to find out more about the work we do at Be Mythical to guide and support old souls in this new world to live their own unique myth, do hop along to bemythical.com and you'll find out all the ways you can join us and go deeper with us on your own mythical journey. Lots of love for now. Mwah. See you again next week.